Writers of America's history purposely ostracized how the use of color theory and concealing coloration impacted the public's perception of racism. Stories about the American slave trade, including the unpopular American white slave trade, classifications of race, American history, and even Black history, and so much more. They tend to leave listeners in a gray area to fill their mental voids with influential new ideas through color. Does color theory play a pivotal role in shaping the narratives and influencing historical perspectives? And if so, how can something as simple as a color help influence the public's perception? Also, I have some information that I will share with you that could give us a possible answer to these questions. If you are watching this video via your cell phone or computer, click the subscribe button and the bell icon to be alerted so you won't miss any of my future videos coming up. The like button is around there too if you choose to rate this video to inform the algorithm that you want to watch more videos within this category. So now, let's begin. Mrs. Calloway, take it from here.
You will be surprised to find out how much color theory has had an effect on the slave trade and Black history. Natural color selection and how we are conditioned to see ourselves play a major role. That's because Black history was created not as a historical account, but as a fictional tale to describe the injustices of slavery on paper in black and white. In order to replace the identity of one group of people with another, the story was then transferred to the character which fit the role most in visual action. This is called concealing coloration. In 1909, Abbott Thayer, an artist well known for his camouflaging technique, published a book called Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom. In this book, he talks about concealing coloration, in which he states that concealing coloration means coloration that matches the background. Since an object's background varies with the point of view, there can be no such thing as complete intrinsic inconspicuousness. The means of objects' recognizability, no matter how they are colored or marked, is almost always their silhouette. This means that no matter how much something is hidden with the right amount of shadow, somehow the truth will always see the light. According to a 2018 MIT article, Thayer's descriptions and demonstrations of background picturing compares it to current computer-based practices of replacing gaps in images with content-aware digital patches. So with this, it is well understood that concealing coloration, color perceived visually, transcends into brain activity that produces a corresponding action. It is also well known that colors themselves have mind-altering effects. To hide something in plain sight, concealing coloration allows for that to take place. It was because of this that from the late 19th century and the early 20th century that artists were being used to camouflage military actions and weaponry through the act of photography. Abbott Thayer was one of these artists that worked to persuade the military to adopt principles of coloration to mask ships, weapons, and troops. It was through the advancement of synthetic color creation and color manufacturing that colors became readily available for use in this matter. That's because it wasn't until the late 19th century that color began to progress into what we know it as today. It was the invention of a synthetic version of indigo that undermined the Indian industry that the British Empire had depended on. and the synthesis of artificial alizarin red in 1868, which established the dominance of the German chemical industry. Leading chemical companies such as BASF, Bayer, Hooks, Ciba Geigy, IG Farben, and ICI began as dye manufacturers. In 1883, Adolf von Baer identified the molecular structure of indigo, and by 1887, Badish Anilin on soda fabric, now BASF, Actian Gesellschaft, patented the commercial production of a synthetic indigo. Bayer's discoveries in indigo earned him a Nobel Prize in 1905. And before the invention of synthetic color and dye manufacturing, colors were created from natural substances that could only be found in particular locations. The colors were transported to different materials using organic dyes, and they were derived from the plants and/or animals of that particular location. The University of Chicago library section on organic dyes and lakes states vegetable dyes can come from all parts of the plant: bark, berries, hulls, leaves, roots, seeds, stems, or wood. Animal dyes come from the ground insects such as reds of the cochineal or kermes, which are harvested off of cacti or oak, respectively. From insect secretions such as those that produce the red lac, or from the glands of sea creatures such as the sepia ink sacs of cuttlefish, or the most famously rare Tyrian purple, to produce 1 gram of dye. The University of Chicago also states that in the 19th century, color manufacturer was considered one of the most important career options, and that it was a job that was to be fulfilled by chemists, whom many artists came to depend on for guidance, because these chemists understood color theory science, which describes how colors work, and specifically much of the science that is used today when it comes to the influence of color on people comes from the understanding of how plants and animals conceal themselves in nature. So taking color theory science from the world of nature and bringing it onto the movie screen was a must for many artists and chemists alike. It was with this intent that the transition from black and white film to color was finally introduced to the public. When most people think of the emergence of color, they think of the transition from black and white television, which occurred somewhere around the 1960s. But color was already fully emerged in the minds of the people for generations. However, there was a pivotal moment in history when many can recall the experience of seeing the original Wizard of Oz, which originally premiered in 1939. But what about the book? Where exactly did this idea of color and how it is presented in this movie, where did it come from? Well, the book that was written in 1899, it was authored by L. Frank Baum. Lyman Frank Baum knew that to color something was to possess it with a flood of different sensations, and this colorizing effect gets embedded in the character or the nature of a thing. That is the definition of color as a verb, and we can assume that he was familiar with this definition through what is stated in the introduction of his previous books. The children's book, Father Goose, which was published in 1899, and Mother Goose in Prose. In the introduction to Mother Goose in Prose, he wrote, "Those things which are earliest impressed upon our minds cling to them the most tenaciously." And in the introduction of Father Goose, he wrote, "There is a fascination in the combination of jingling verse and bright pictures that always appeals strongly to children." The ancient Mother Goose book had these qualities, and for nearly 2 centuries, the cadences of its rhymes have lingered in the memories of men and women who learned them in childhood. From these written statements alone, we can ascertain that L. Frank Baum was well aware of the effects of color and how it can influence people, especially when it is used as an influence at an early age. He invokes this concept in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. He defines his book as a modernized fairy tale that succeeds in educating the child on morality, but it does so in a more gentle fashion, being well aware that these stories are used to guide the moral compass of the children. He starts this story within a gray area. This is a mental concept which is used in order to change someone's perspective, especially when dealing with children who have not lived long enough to fully understand life. They may not be aware of certain circumstances and situations that could exist. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines a gray area as an area or situation in which it is difficult to judge what is right and what is wrong. And with knowing this, L. Frank Baum uses this to his advantage, as he uses the book's first few pages to describe how everything is gray. The grass is gray, the sky is gray, and everything in existence, including the people's attitudes, are gray. This is a deliberate predisposition that takes the children's mentalities into a gray area in real time, and it is used to wipe their slate clean mentally. By mentally taking children into this gray area, where everything appears to be gray, once color fully emerges, new ideas can be formed and then accepted. So what does all of this have to do with Black history and the slave trade, you may ask? Well, everything. The slave trade and the enslavement of peons, also known as peonage, is something that only a few may easily recall due to the media and the current propaganda that exists and that tries to control the narrative of the mental image of slavery. Because of this, most people only get a one-sided account of history. And it's not one-sided because the victors are the ones who wrote it, but instead it's an act of concealment that is used to cover and divert the attention of the masses from further investigation. And because this information can't be easily erased completely, it is dressed as a new character within the form of Black history. Black history meaning history that we all want to be forgotten. According to Colorito, or the harmony of coloring in painting, which was one of the oldest books on color theory, Black is a deep hiding or privation of lights. That is why it was rewritten as Black history. It is a history that has been rewritten, but with only subtle changes that now introduce the Negro as the slave, as it also merges the Negro with the copper-colored Indians of America, labeling them both Black. It was with purposeful intent that they have now been colored and marked as the main characters of slavery. In this desperate attempt to give incoming foreigners a better future for their current offspring and their future generations to come, this plan was devised to erase the white slave trade completely from the history books. According to the University of Washington's Seattle General Strike Project, there was an article published for the Seattle Union Record on July 15, 1911. It was written by Reverend Charles Stetzel, and it was titled Getting a Right Start. In this article, Stetzel writes, "When a boy starts out handicapped by weaknesses and vices which were inherited, it means a hard pull if he is going to win." According to the Seattle General Strike Project, this article deals with the issue of trying to give your children a better life than you had by giving them a healthy body and strong character. It is important to note that just 1 year prior, in 1910, a treaty was signed in Paris for the suppression of the white slave trade. It is also important to note that even though peonage was prohibited since 1867, in the early 1900s, it was still prevalent and under investigation. For example, an article published January 21, 2013, for the University of Texas at Austin describes how former governor of Maryland, Elihu Emory Jackson, also known as E.E. Jackson, owned land in the southern Alabama forest known as the Jackson Tract. And in the early 1900s, Jackson, along with several other lumbermen and railroad executives, carried out a strategy that required transporting poorly provisioned European immigrant labor deep into the forest to perform the brutal task of felling and hauling timber. According to the article, a calculating labor manager, William S. Harlan, and sadistic foreman, Bob Gallagher, and S.E. Huggins, established a horrendous regime of forced labor that led to a physical and legal battle between managers, workers, and progressive reformers. The article goes on to discuss how the Jackson Lumber Company exploited thousands of foreign contract laborers as foreign immigrant workers because they knew little of the dangers of the forest industry. Jackson hired labor agents such as Sigmund Schwartz and Frank and Miller Company in New York to recruit these immigrants for the Jackson tract. Recruiters lied to them about wages, fees for transportation, and concealed its abusive practices. The idea of this type of practice happening from one immigrant to another has been well hidden within American history, to the point that if you look up information about peonage, it consistently reverts back to the false historical information about the slavery of the so-called blacks, also referred to as African Americans. And of course, this is purposely done to keep your mind occupied in the gray area, because most people in America are being labeled on a physical or mental face value using the colors of either white or black, which when you mix together equates to gray. And if you listen closely, the true nature of things will reveal themselves to you, like with immigrants from Europe and what they are grouped as. Logically speaking, regardless of the spelling, you can find that there is a much deeper meaning behind the term European, with its true meaning being hidden all of this time through the act of concealing coloration. I'm just here to make you think.